What happened to the doctor who dared to correct the mistakes made by the emperor himself?
Shadow Archive.
The halls of the Imperial Medical Institute in Beijing were quiet that summer, too quiet for a place tasked with tending to the body of an empire. Every whisper behind a lacquered screen, every flick of a physician's brush on silk, carried the weight of potential treason. Li Shizhen had long since stopped fearing that. He moved silently through the corridors, his long robes sweeping the ground like shadows cast at dusk. Though barely 50, his face was lined with the long creases of someone who had lived many lives. Doctor, scholar, herbalist, dissident. His father had trained him with rigid precision, demanding not only the memorization of texts but a reverence for the ancient way. Li had obeyed, for a time. Now, he studied not to serve the palace but to correct it. By the 32nd year of the Jiajing Emperor's reign, medicine had become a matter of ritual more than science. The emperor, deep in his Taoist delusions, obsessed over alchemical concoctions promising immortality. Gold, cinnabar, mercury, poisons paraded as panaceas. And while eunuchs delivered these elixirs to the throne, commoners in the countryside died of fevers, boils, or poisonings from misidentified herbs. The official pharmacopoeia, a sacred volume unchanged for generations, was riddled with errors, some fatal. Li Shizhen had seen a boy convulse from eating what had been prescribed as a cooling root. He died within hours. The root had been confused with another of similar name and shape. The book had been wrong. That was the day Li stopped treating patients and began treating knowledge. His plan was audacious: to rewrite China's entire medical canon. To collect, verify, and classify every known substance, plant, animal, mineral, and correct centuries of inherited error. He would call it the Bensao Gangmu, the Compendium of Materia Medica. He would not ask permission. The first volume alone had taken 3 years. For every entry, Li Shizhen personally dissected, tested, or observed the ingredient. He journeyed to mountain monasteries, coastal salt pans, inner villages no scholar had ever dared visit. He listened to herbalists, hunters, and midwives. He recorded their words in silence, his quill never pausing. He knew the risks. Altering the ancient pharmacopoeia without imperial sanction was an offense bordering on heresy. To claim the old texts were wrong was to accuse the emperors who had sanctioned them of being misled, or worse, ignorant. The Ming court did not tolerate such implications. Scholars had disappeared for less. Still, he wrote. Now, as he unrolled the bamboo scrolls before him in a small, borrowed study outside Hubei, the 7th volume was nearly complete. His eyes ached, but the characters flowed, brisk, spare, undeniable. A knock on the door. 3 times. A rhythm. Not a servant. He opened it. Standing in the lantern's spill of light was a man dressed like a scholar but bearing himself like a soldier. His eyes, narrow and sharp, fixed on the scrolls behind Li Shizhen. "You are Dr. Li?" Li nodded. His hand did not leave the latch. The man bowed. "I bring word from the Southern Inspectorate. Your name has appeared in their ledgers." It was not a question. It was a warning. Li stepped aside and let him in. For the first time in months, he considered hiding the manuscripts. The man introduced himself only as Ren. He declined tea and sat rigidly, not on the cushion Li offered, but near the threshold, as if he didn't intend to stay long, or feared staying too long might implicate him. Ren produced a small, folded paper from his sleeve. On it was a crude list of names written in a court hand. Officials, writers, physicians, next to each, a mark. A red X or a black O. Li's name bore neither. Only a space, empty, waiting. "They suspect," Ren said. "But they don't yet act." Li studied the ink, already drying. The paper smelled faintly of smoke. "I've read your work," Ren added. "Some entries would be considered revisionist. Some, treasonous." "I write what is true," Li replied. "That's not the question. The question is whether the truth is permitted." Ren stood. The emperor does not like to be contradicted. Especially not by doctors. He reached into his sash and handed Li a small scroll. A single name was written on it, Wang Shizhen. Li recognized it instantly. His father. "Your family's name shields you," Ren said, already halfway through the door. "But shields crack." He disappeared into the dusk like he had never been there. Li stared at the name for a long while. Wang Shizhen. a revered physician of the old school, loyal to the court, cautious to a fault. It was his father's credibility that had opened the gates of the Imperial Medical Institute to Li in the first place. It was that same legacy that now restrained Li's enemies from moving openly against him. But legacies faded quickly in Beijing. The next morning, Li made a decision. The compendium would not remain a quiet rebellion tucked into scrolls. It would be finished, not for imperial approval, but for preservation. He would risk everything to make sure the book reached the next generation, even if he did not. He sent a coded letter to his eldest son, Li Jianzhong, instructing him to travel to Jinling, where sympathetic scholars might help copy and hide the work. Another letter was dispatched to a Taoist hermit in the Wudang Mountains, a man who had once studied poisons for the court and vanished rather than create another elixir for the emperor's immortality. Within a week, shadows began to stir. A courier was found dead by the roadside near Xiangyang, his satchel torn open, its contents missing. A man claiming to be from the Ministry of Rites visited the small medical house where Li once worked, asking pointed questions about unauthorized texts. In Hubei, a fire destroyed a printing house that had only days earlier received samples of Li's manuscripts. It was clear now. Someone in the capital had decided to act. Li relocated at night, traveling upriver under assumed names, carrying fragments of the compendium sewn into the lining of his robe. He ate little, spoke less, and wrote feverishly by candlelight wherever he rested. By the time he reached Nanjing, word came that the emperor himself had taken ill, a mysterious ailment the palace physicians could not treat. Whispers said his latest elixir, made of crushed pearls and mercury, had turned his tongue black. In the halls of the institute, panic reigned. In the chaos, Li saw an opportunity. He instructed Jianzhong to deliver a bound section of the compendium to an old contact inside the court, a low-ranking archivist known only as Dao. If Dao succeeded in placing the volume within the imperial library without attribution, it might survive untouched for decades. Perhaps even centuries. But weeks passed. No word came from Dao. Then, one night, a scroll arrived, half-burned, stained with blood, but unmistakably written in Dao's hand. 5 words. They know who you are. The message shattered any remaining illusion of distance. Beijing's reach extended far beyond its walls, threading through provincial villages and ancient forests alike. Even among herbalists and recluses, Li Shizhen's name had become dangerous to speak aloud. He no longer slept in the same place twice. He no longer trusted ink that wasn't his own. The unfinished volumes of the compendium were now split into bundles, each hidden with people who owed him nothing and knew even less. A fisherman on the Yangtze kept the toxicology chapter beneath loose boards in his boat. A blind calligrapher in Suzhou stored the volume on marine herbs among scrolls meant for the temple. A young widow near Hangzhou, whose child Li had once cured of a fever, agreed to bury the section on mineral compounds in a dry well beneath her home. But time was bleeding from him. His health began to falter. Years of fieldwork, poor food, and the weight of paranoia had sapped his strength. His hands, once precise enough to dissect a bee's abdomen, now trembled. It was Jianzhong who found him collapsed outside a shrine near Yueyang. Li regained consciousness 2 days later, lying on straw, the smell of camphor in the air. "You should have stayed away," he rasped. "And let you die alone?" Jianzhong replied. Li tried to rise. His son held him down gently. "The court has begun asking for your whereabouts by name," Jianzhong said. "They say you've been seen with smugglers. That you've written a book discrediting the sacred texts. That you're poisoning the people with false knowledge." Li smiled faintly. "Then they've read it." But Jianzhong's expression didn't change. "They've sent the censors to your birthplace." Li felt the words like a blade. Qizhou, nestled in the shadow of the Dabi Mountains, had long been safe, too remote, too humble to attract scrutiny. His ancestral home still stood there, quiet among groves of camphor trees. If the officials descended on it, they would find the workshop. The shelves of test vials. The drawings. The drafts. And perhaps worse, his name written beside them. He rose that night. Against Jianzhong's protests, he prepared to return to Qizhou alone. If there was anything left to salvage, he would salvage it himself. But when he arrived days later, the house was gone. Nothing remained but ash and stone. The garden, once fragrant with mugwort and peony, had been trampled into mud. The air still smelled faintly of smoke. Li stood for a long time in silence, as if the trees themselves might tell him who had given the order. Then he began digging. He found what he was looking for beneath the third step of the eastern entrance, a compartment his father had carved decades ago during a bandit uprising. Inside, a wrapped parcel of rice paper, its edges singed but its core intact. The final chapter of the compendium, the one on antidotes. He wept, not from grief, but from the unbearable precision of fate. It was time to finish. Li retreated to the mountains, a narrow cave above the Yangtze Valley where no messenger would reach him and no official would care to follow. There, through winter and into spring, he wrote by firelight, the ink freezing in the well some nights before he could complete a sentence. He ate dried roots and boiled pine bark. His cough deepened, his breath came short. But the words flowed. And when it was done, 52 volumes, 1,892 substances described, 11,000 prescriptions, he laid down his brush. His body, worn to its threads, failed him shortly after. But his son did not. Jianzhong gathered the scattered volumes from their hiding places. Some were smudged, some damaged by water or rats. But most survived. He recopied them by hand, then traveled the empire seeking those who might preserve them. A retired scholar in Shaanxi, a Buddhist scribe in Chengdu, a merchant in Nanjing with secret ties to dissident printers. By the time the emperor died, his lips blackened, his blood thick with mercury, Li Shizhen's compendium was already moving through back channels. It passed in whispers and shadows, one copy at a time. Officially, the court never sanctioned it. Unofficially, they failed to erase it. Years later, a new dynasty would rise, and a new emperor, desperate to rebuild a crumbling nation, would order the ancient medical texts reviewed. They would find a book. Anonymous, unbound. Its ink faded, but its words still alive. It was the Wanli emperor, a boy not yet 15, who unknowingly revived Li Shizhen's legacy. Amid the debris of the Jiajing emperor's decaying court, the young monarch's advisors combed through the archives in search of order, or at least the appearance of it. Libraries were reopened. Forgotten scrolls, previously sealed or condemned, were reassessed under the guise of bureaucratic clarity. Among these, in a corner of the imperial library untouched by footfall for a generation, a low-ranking clerk named Yao discovered a peculiar set of bound volumes. There was no title page, no imperial seal, no author's name. But the writing was methodical. The classifications, unlike any other medical text. Diagrams of organs, veins of ore, cross-sections of leaves, all sketched with a scholar's discipline and a surgeon's eye. Some of the materials described were unknown to the clerks, and yet the entries bore the weight of undeniable truth. Yao brought the manuscript to his superior, who brought it to the Bureau of Rights. And from there, its ascent was unstoppable. The Bensao Gangmu had returned. Still, no one spoke Li Shizhen's name aloud. To do so was to acknowledge the court's failure, both in rejecting him and in attempting to erase him. Instead, the book was cited anonymously in public records and printed quietly by independent presses in southern provinces. It was passed among physicians, scholars, and apothecaries like a sacred inheritance. Within 20 years, versions of it began appearing in Korea and Japan. Monks carried it to Okinawa. Maritime traders smuggled copies to Vietnam. It became a silent revolution, not by blade or proclamation, but by knowledge. Jianzhong, now aging and cautious, continued his father's work in secret. He annotated the margins, added local variations to the prescriptions, and trained 3 disciples, each sworn not to teach but to preserve. The book would live not in shelves but in memory. Then, in the 1620s, as famine and war returned to China, a new threat emerged. The Ming Dynasty itself began to collapse. The Manchus loomed beyond the Great Wall, and in the shadow of dynastic failure, old enemies stirred. A surviving censor, one who had once signed Li Shizhen's condemnation in the Jiajing court, reappeared under the new regime. He recognized the compendium, he remembered its defiance, and he remembered the name. He petitioned the court to ban the book once more. But this time, the emperor refused. By then, the Bensao Gangmu had saved too many lives. It had corrected too many errors. A plague in Sichuan had been controlled thanks to its identification of waterborne toxins. In Yunnan, an outbreak of skin lesions was cured using its recipe for a poultice of burnt mulberry ash and vinegar. Midwives in the north swore by its childbirth protocols. Even the court's own physicians, who had once scorned Li now quoted his entries from memory. Silencing it now would be more dangerous than embracing it. And so, a decree was issued. The compendium would be formally recognized. Li Shizhen was posthumously granted a title, Doctor of National Healing. His lineage restored. His books allowed in the Imperial Academy. But Jianzhong never heard the news. He died in a modest hut outside Jingzhou, unknown to the scholars who owed their science to his devotion. His disciples buried him beside the ashes of his father's manuscripts. A single phrase was carved into his headstone. He wrote so others would not die. Years passed, then decades. The dynasty fell, replaced by another, and yet another after that. Each regime tried, in its own way, to stamp itself into history, with monuments, wars, and edicts. But history remembers what endures. The Bensao Gangmu endured. By the 18th century, its influence had spread far beyond China's borders. In Japan, samurai physicians used its herbal classifications to treat battlefield injuries. In Korea, scholars translated entire volumes into Hangul, distributing them to village healers. European traders smuggled portions of the text aboard Dutch East India ships, where natural philosophers in Amsterdam dissected the volumes and marveled at its taxonomies, centuries ahead of their own. What began as a solitary rebellion against imperial ignorance became a cornerstone of world medicine. Still, the man behind it remained, to most, a ghost. Then, in the early 1900s, amid the fading days of Qing rule and the rising pulse of revolution, a young archivist named Xu Bicheng stumbled upon an original draft of the compendium in the ruins of a private library near Suzhou. Its cover was brittle, the ink faded. But the name inside, Li Shizhen of Qizhou, was unmistakable. Xu, defiant in his own time, decided to make it public. He published an annotated version, restored Li's authorship, and delivered lectures across the Republic about the man who had once challenged an emperor with nothing but a brush. His lectures were banned. But they spread anyway. By the 1920s, Li Shizhen's name had re-entered the national vocabulary, not as a court physician, nor a heretic, but as a symbol. A reminder that truth, once written, does not die quietly. Revolutionaries quoted him, reformers praised him, even skeptics admired the scope of his work, which spanned medicine, botany, zoology, geology, and chemistry, all before any of those were formal disciplines. In the People's Republic that followed, Li Shizhen was officially recognized as one of the founding figures of traditional Chinese medicine. Statues were raised, schools were named, but perhaps the greatest tribute came not in marble or law, but in daily life. A midwife in rural Henan, delivering a breech birth using Li's herbal compress. A doctor in Singapore referencing his section on digestive cures. A child in Yunnan cured of fever with a tea made from bitter herbs, following a prescription recorded 5 centuries earlier. The knowledge moved quietly, without permission, as it always had. And so the shadow of the emperor, vast as it once seemed, was eventually outlived by the shadow of the man who had dared to correct him. A man who had believed that the truth, once discovered, should belong to all. Beneath the limestone cliffs of Hubei, near the riverbank where Li Shizhen once collected specimens, a series of scrolls were discovered in the spring of 1966, hidden within a sealed clay jar buried beneath a fallen scholar's shrine. The jar contained dried roots, a pair of carved bone tweezers, and pages from what appeared to be an early draft of the compendium. The timing could not have been worse. The Cultural Revolution had begun. In the chaos, traditional texts were being seized and destroyed, their owners publicly humiliated or worse. Knowledge was declared dangerous unless approved. Books burned. Schools purged. And yet, when the scrolls were brought to a local cadre for inspection, a curious thing happened: he didn't report them. The cadre, young and doctrinaire, had once been treated for a rare infection using a remedy his grandmother swore came from Dr. Li's book. The infection had nearly killed him. The tea, brewed from a weed growing near pig pens, had saved his life. He read the scrolls by candlelight that night, alone. The next day, he sealed them again in fresh cloth, labeled them as agricultural field notes, and sent them to a museum in Wuhan, where an archivist quietly filed them away. Decades later, those pages would be verified as part of Li Shizhen's original manuscript, ink matched, phrasing unique, annotations in his own hand. Among them was a passage not found in later editions. It was a warning. Let none mistake this book for certainty. Let it be only a map, not a boundary. What I record today may be disproved tomorrow. But let no future healer fear to rewrite what I have written, if truth demands it. It was heresy in his time. It was prophecy in ours. By the early 21st century, Li Shizhen's work had found a new generation of readers. Digitized, translated, studied not only in schools of traditional medicine, but in pharmacology labs, biodiversity research centers, and medical history departments worldwide. A team of botanists in Taiwan used his entries to rediscover a plant once thought extinct. A cancer researcher in Berlin, testing compounds described in Li's section on toxic herbs, identified promising anti-tumor properties in a substance previously ignored for centuries. In Harvard and Oxford, lectures were given on the Bensao Gangmu as a precursor to the scientific method, centuries before the West claimed to invent it. But the most remarkable revelation came in 2019. A Chinese geneticist, studying the hereditary markers of resistance to a rare liver toxin, found that villagers in certain parts of Hubei carried an unusual mutation. Tracing oral histories, she found they all descended from a single physician's line, one that had survived despite imperial purges, famine, war, and political terror. Their ancestor had been known simply as the doctor who walked with ash in his sleeves. Li Shizhen. The knowledge that had once threatened his life now lived inside his descendants, not just in memory, but in blood. In the quiet dawn of a village near present-day Qizhou, the very hills where Li Shizhen once foraged mugwort and ginkgo leaves, an old woman knelt by a stone tablet faded by centuries of wind. She came every year, carrying with her a bundle wrapped in cloth, dried herbs, pressed meticulously, labeled in two scripts, one modern, one ancient. She was the last surviving member of a line that had never boasted of its origin. Her grandfather had warned her as a child, "We do not seek monuments. We plant seeds." She had never met Li Shizhen, but she remembered the stories. How he once healed a hunter with wolf's bane. How he survived poison by tasting it himself. How he had vanished into the mountains not to escape death, but to outlive it through knowledge. Today, she brought not herbs, but paper, a printed copy of the latest international medical journal, with an article titled, "Bioactive Properties of Herbs Described in the Bensao Gangmu, a Molecular Review." The abstract cited over 70 of Li's entries, not out of cultural reverence, but scientific necessity. Across the globe, researchers had confirmed correlations between Li's classifications and modern chemical analyses. Substances once dismissed as superstition were revealing antimicrobial, anti-inflammatory, and neuroprotective effects. What he had described with the language of qi and humors was now being mapped in molecules and neurotransmitters. And yet, the article noted, the author himself warned against certainty. It was that humility, buried in the margins of a banned book, that set Li Shizhen apart. He had not written for glory. He had written so that those who came after him would ask better questions than those before. As the woman laid the paper at the base of the stone, she noticed a group of students passing nearby, university researchers, judging by their gear. One approached respectfully, bowing lightly. "Is this the tomb of Dr. Li?" She nodded. He held out a small device. "Would you mind if we scan the inscription?" She waved her hand in welcome, stepping back. The student knelt and captured the faint characters on the tablet, not for a museum, not for a textbook, but for a digital archive that would render them readable to anyone with a phone, anywhere in the world. As he worked, the sun rose behind the hills. Light filtered through the leaves of a ginkgo tree, the same species Li had described for treating memory loss. He could not have imagined this future, but he had written for it. A future where knowledge, once forbidden, became medicine. Where a man who defied an emperor lived longer than any empire. Where a book, bound in secrecy and risk, became the most read medical text in human history. And where a name, once erased, returned, not in ink, but in every healed wound, every corrected error, every truth that no longer feared to be known. Li Shizhen. Scholar, healer, rebel, author of shadows, voice of truth.